Welcome to Eternal Darkness, where nightmares come to life. I'll be your host through these twisted tales tonight. Before we descend into the shadows, remember to like and subscribe to join our growing community of horror enthusiasts. Get comfortable, turn down the lights, and prepare yourself as we begin our journey into the unknown. I grew up on a stretch of land tucked behind Rattlesnake Ridge, an expanse of farmland and forest that stretched farther than my young eyes could measure. The year was 2015, and I was barely 12 years old when my world felt infinite and safe. For most of my childhood, this place felt like my personal playground, a kingdom where danger was nothing more than scraped knees and bee stings. My older brother Marcus and I spent countless afternoons chasing each other across the rolling fields, our laughter echoing off the weathered barn walls and drifting toward the distant tree line. The property had been in our family for 3 generations, passed down from my great-grandfather who'd carved this life from raw wilderness back in the 1940s. Every acre held memories. Every trail bore the footprints of our ancestors. If we wanted a change of pace from racing through the tall grass, we'd wander down to this cluster of thin alder trees off the lower pasture. The grove sat in a natural depression where spring water collected, creating a perpetually damp environment that kept the soil soft and the trees flexible. The trunks were so supple that you could climb halfway up, wrap your arms around the smooth bark, then lean forward and ride them back down like a giant springboard. It was pure exhilaration. The moment when you'd commit your weight forward, feeling the tree bend beneath you, branches snapping and whipping past your face as you descended in a controlled fall. The ground would rush up to meet you, and both of us would hit the soft earth whooping with excitement, our clothes stained with mud and bark fragments. We'd spend hours perfecting our technique, seeing who could ride the tallest tree or execute the most dramatic dismount. That was our world back then. Wide open, full of life and possibility, bounded only by the fence lines our father had built and maintained. The cattle grazed peacefully in the upper fields, their gentle lowing a constant soundtrack to our adventures. Our mother would call us in for dinner from the kitchen window, her voice carrying easily across the open space. Everything felt secure, predictable, wonderfully ordinary. The farmhouse itself was a 2-story structure built in the 1960s, with white clapboard siding that needed repainting and a wraparound porch where we'd sit on summer evenings, watching fireflies dance in the twilight. My bedroom was on the 2nd floor, facing east toward the road that wound down through the lower pasture. From my window, I could see almost the entire length of our property, from the upper hayfields down to where our land met the state forest. Those early years were painted in golden hues of safety and routine. Chores were manageable adventures, feeding the chickens, collecting eggs, helping Dad repair fence posts. The rhythm of farm life felt eternal, as if nothing could ever disturb the peaceful cycle of seasons that governed our existence. I believed then that I knew every inch of our land, every tree and rock and hidden stream. How wrong I was. One autumn day in late October 2015, everything changed. I remember the bite of the crisp air against my exposed skin, the way my breath formed small clouds as we hiked the gentle slope toward our favorite bendy alders. The leaves had turned brilliant shades of yellow and orange, creating a canopy of fire above our heads. The hint of damp moss and decomposing vegetation filled our nostrils, that distinctive smell of autumn in the Pacific Northwest. Marcus and I were already knee-deep in mud by the time we reached the grove, our boots making obscene sucking sounds with each step. We were eager for the adrenaline rush we got from swaying to the ground on those flexible trunks. It had become our ritual, our way of claiming dominance over this small corner of wilderness that felt entirely ours. The familiar sounds of our games filled the air. Snap, crash, the normal everyday noises that went along with our tree-riding adventures. We knew what breaking branches sounded like. Small twigs made a quick pop, like cap guns firing. Thicker ones created this deeper crack that resonated through the grove. Medium-sized branches produced a sharp report followed by the rustling cascade of leaves and debris. It never scared us. Not until we heard something that shouldn't have been there. We'd just finished a particularly successful round of our makeshift tree surfing. Marcus had managed to ride a trunk almost to the ground before executing a perfect roll that left him laughing and covered in wet leaves. I was preparing for my turn, sizing up a particularly promising alder, when a different kind of snapping started echoing through the grove. This wasn't the clean break of a branch under pressure. This was something else entirely, louder, heavier, more violent. It cut through the air with a force I'd never experienced, like the sound of entire trees being torn apart at their base. The noise had a wet, organic quality that made my stomach clench with inexplicable dread. Marcus glanced at me, his mud-streaked grin twisting into alarm, and I realized he heard it too. The expression on his face mirrored my own growing terror. Eyes wide, mouth slightly open, body frozen in the universal posture of prey, sensing a predator. We both stopped moving, our playful energy evaporating like morning mist. The cracking sounds kept rolling in, growing louder with each passing second, as if logs 2 or 3 times thicker than the ones we were playing on were being systematically destroyed. The rhythm was irregular, chaotic, but there was an intelligence behind it that made the hair on my arms stand on end. This wasn't the random destruction of a storm or the methodical work of human machinery. I tried desperately to make sense of what we were hearing. We knew the rumble of bulldozers and tractors. Our dad worked those machines all the time, and their engines had a distinctive mechanical growl. But this was different, more primal. Like some massive presence was crushing mature trunks underfoot, splintering them like matchsticks as it moved through the forest. The worst part was we couldn't see the source of the noise. The trees formed a wall of leafy shadows around us, and beyond that, everything felt eerily dim despite the afternoon light. The normal sounds of the forest, bird calls, rustling leaves, the distant lowing of cattle, had stopped completely, as if every living thing was holding its breath. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, it all stopped. Not gradually, not with a final crack that tapered off into silence. 1 second, the grove was filled with the sound of destruction. The next, it was dead quiet. The absence of sound was almost more terrifying than the noise itself. We were left standing there with our breath coming in ragged gasps, our heads craned upward, scanning the alders for a glimpse of whatever was out there. The silence pressed against my eardrums like a physical weight. My heart hammered against my ribs so hard I was sure Marcus could hear it. A cold prickle of dread coiled in my gut, spreading outward like poison through my bloodstream. The land we knew so well, the grove that had been our sanctuary, suddenly felt strange and unwelcoming. The familiar trees seemed to loom over us with menace, their shadows taking on sinister shapes that shifted and moved in my peripheral vision. I wanted to run, but my legs felt like they were made of concrete. Every instinct screamed at me to flee, to get away from this place as fast as possible. But terror had frozen me in place. Marcus was equally paralyzed, his face pale beneath the streaks of mud, his hands trembling as he gripped the trunk of the nearest alder. The air itself felt different now, charged with malevolence. What had been a cool autumn day now seemed oppressively heavy, as if the atmosphere was pressing down on us with the weight of something unnatural. The smell of decomposing leaves took on a more sinister quality, reminding me of death and decay rather than the natural cycle of seasons. Marcus started to whisper something, maybe to tell me we should head back to the house, when the most terrifying sound I'd ever heard ripped through the silence. It was a roar, but not like anything I'd heard before. Not a bear, not a cougar, not any animal I could identify. It was impossibly deep and powerful, seeming to come from everywhere at once. The sound hit me like a physical blow, reverberating through my chest cavity and making my bones ache. It carried undertones of rage and hunger that bypassed my rational mind and spoke directly to some primitive part of my brain that still remembered when humans were prey. Every hair on my neck and arms prickled as if I'd been struck by lightning. The roar seemed to go on forever, building in intensity until I thought my eardrums might burst. It was so powerful I could feel it in my feet, vibrating up through the ground and into my bones. Birds exploded from the trees around us. their panicked cries adding to the chaos as they fled in all directions. When it finally ended, the silence that followed was even more oppressive than before. My ears were ringing, and I realized I was hyperventilating. Marcus had gone completely white, his eyes wide with primal terror. We both understood without speaking that we had just heard something that shouldn't exist. My legs seemed to move on their own, stumbling backward away from the tree line where the sound had originated. Marcus was right beside me, muttering words under his breath that I couldn't make out. Prayers, maybe, or just the kind of mindless verbal noise people make when their minds can't process what they've experienced. We didn't linger to see if the creature, if that's what it was, would step into view. The thought of actually seeing whatever had made that sound was more terrifying than our current ignorance. We tore up that slope, sliding on loose gravel and patches of wet leaves, nearly colliding with each other in our haste to escape. I remember the metallic taste of adrenaline flooding my mouth, the way my heart felt like it might explode from the strain. Behind us, the grove remained silent, but I could feel something watching us retreat. The sensation of unseen eyes tracking our movements made my skin crawl and added speed to our desperate flight. When we reached the house, we barged in through the back door, panting so hard it took a full minute before either of us could speak coherently. Our mother stood at the kitchen sink, alarmed by our sudden, disheveled appearance. We were covered in mud and leaves, our faces flushed from exertion and terror, our eyes still wide with shock. As soon as we tried to explain, babbling about snapping trees and an impossible roar that seemed to come from hell itself, her face softened into a look I recognized all too well. It was the expression adults get when they think children are letting their imaginations run wild. Patient but dismissive, kind but utterly unconvinced. "Probably just a bear," she said with that maddeningly calm tone parents use when they think they're being reasonable. "Or you two just got yourselves worked up playing in those trees. You know how sounds can echo strangely in the forest." No matter how hard we insisted it was bigger, louder, more frightening than any bear could possibly be, she wouldn't budge from her explanation. We tried to describe the systematic destruction of trees, the inhuman quality of the roar, the way every other sound in the forest had stopped, as if nature itself was cowering in fear. But the more details we provided, the more she seemed convinced we were embellishing a simple wildlife encounter. "Bears can be quite loud when they're establishing territory," she said, turning back to her dishes as if the matter was settled. "Especially this time of year when they're preparing for winter. I'm sure it seems scary, but there's nothing out there that poses any real danger." She told us to clean off our muddy shoes and go about our day, dismissing our terror as if it were nothing more than a scraped knee that needed a band-aid. The casual way she brushed off our experience made me feel small and helpless. How could she not understand that something fundamental had changed? How could she act as if the world was still the same safe place it had been that morning? That night, I could barely settle into my bed. The familiar creaks and groans of the old house, sounds that had always been comforting, now seemed ominous. Every time I closed my eyes, my thoughts wandered back to the moment that relentless crashing fell silent, and how that unearthly roar seemed to rip through the very fabric of reality. The lower pasture, the place that had once felt like our personal amusement park, now felt like a different realm altogether, a place where unknown things prowled and hunted. I wanted desperately to forget it, to chalk it up to an overactive imagination like my mother had suggested, but I couldn't push it from my mind. Sleep, when it finally came, was fitful and full of nightmares. I dreamed of enormous shapes moving through the darkness, of trees being torn apart by invisible hands, of roars that made the earth itself tremble. I would wake in cold sweats, my sheets soaked with perspiration, my heart racing as I strained to listen for sounds from outside. During the day, I found myself constantly glancing toward the lower pasture, expecting to see some sign of the previous day's encounter. But the grove looked exactly as it always had, peaceful, innocent, giving no hint of the terror it had hosted. This somehow made everything worse, as if the land itself was conspiring to make me doubt my own memories. I began to understand why people didn't report strange encounters. It wasn't just the fear of ridicule, it was the way reality seemed to reassert itself, making the extraordinary seem impossible even to those who had experienced it firsthand. But I knew what I had heard, and I knew that our little corner of paradise had been invaded by something that shouldn't exist. It had been 3 weeks since that day in the alder grove, and I was still on edge every waking moment. During daylight hours, I managed to keep most of the worry tucked away in the back of my mind, buried under schoolwork and chores and the desperate attempt to maintain some semblance of normalcy. But once the sun dipped below the ridgeline, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, all bets were off. Night became my enemy. Every snapping twig outside my bedroom window turned my thoughts back to whatever had roared at us from the depths of the grove. The familiar sounds of the farm, cattle lowing, the barn door creaking in the wind, the distant hoot of an owl, all took on sinister undertones. I would lie in bed, rigid with tension, parsing every noise for signs of danger. My parents noticed how tense I became each time I had to walk down to the barn for evening chores. They offered no real comfort beyond their continued insistence that we had simply encountered a confused bear. Their rational explanations felt like betrayals, as if they were choosing deliberate blindness over the safety of their own children. One evening in mid-November, exhaustion finally got the better of me. I'd spent hours chasing down a stray calf that had somehow gotten through a gap in the fence, and the physical exertion had drained me completely. I remember collapsing onto my bed still half-dressed, my muscles aching from the effort, drifting in and out of that twilight state between waking and sleeping. The old flip clock on my nightstand cast its faint green glow across the room, the numbers changing with soft mechanical clicks that usually helped lull me to sleep. Outside, November wind rattled the windows in their frames, and bare tree branches scraped against the house with sounds like fingernails on wood. It must have been nearly 2 in the morning when I stirred, my bladder finally overriding my exhaustion. The clock display read 1:47, those bright, illuminated numbers casting a hazy light that made everything else in the room seem even darker by comparison. My eyes felt gritty with fatigue, but nature was calling insistently. I swung my feet over the edge of the mattress, the hardwood floor cold against my bare soles. That was when I happened to glance toward the window, and my blood turned to ice in my veins. At first, I saw just the road, the familiar dirt path that wound down through the lower pasture toward the state forest. We'd cleared several trees near the house the previous summer to improve the view, so I had an unobstructed sight line all the way to the tree line. The moon was full and high, bathing everything in that peculiar silver light that makes the world look like a black and white photograph. I blinked hard, trying to convince myself that fatigue was playing tricks on my vision. But there, off to the right near the edge of the forest, something was moving. As I watched in mounting horror, it stepped into clearer view. The figure was impossibly tall and broad, unlike any human being I'd ever seen. Even at a distance of several hundred yards, I could make out the dark silhouette of massive shoulders that seemed to dwarf the fence posts nearby. Its head looked proportionately huge, though the darkness made it impossible to discern any features. The thing's entire body seemed to radiate a kind of wrongness that made my skin crawl. Our property line fence down there was exactly 5 feet tall. I knew because I'd helped Dad install it the year before. Yet this figure's torso hovered well above it, suggesting a height that had to be at least 8 or 9 feet. The scale was all wrong, like something from a nightmare had stepped into the real world. I froze in terror, my bare feet glued to the floor, watching as the thing took 2 enormous strides across the dirt road. That's how I knew beyond any doubt that it wasn't human. No person could cross that 20-foot span so quickly, especially not while maintaining such an unsettling grace. It moved like it weighed nothing, gliding across the ground with a fluidity that defied physics. My thoughts immediately flashed back to that explosive roar in the alder grove, and a jolt of pure terror coursed through my nervous system. The connection was undeniable. This had to be the same entity, some unknown creature that had claimed our land as part of its territory. Any lingering hope that I'd imagined everything before evaporated in that moment. The thing moved with purpose, not like an animal wandering randomly, but like something with intelligence and intent. It paused at the edge of the road, and for a heart-stopping moment, I thought it might be looking directly at the house. At me. The sensation of being observed by something inhuman and potentially hostile made every nerve in my body scream in alarm. Panicking, I reached over with trembling hands to flip my clock face down, afraid that even that mild green glow might give away my presence. The room plunged into complete darkness, but somehow that made things worse. Now I couldn't see what the creature was doing, couldn't tell if it was approaching the house or moving away. I inched myself lower on the mattress, doing my best to slip completely out of view while still maintaining a tiny sliver of vision through the bottom corner of the window. Every breath felt like it echoed through the entire room, and I was certain the thundering of my heart could be heard for miles. The bed springs creaked softly under my weight, and I froze, terrified that the sound might attract the thing's attention. 1,000 questions tore through my mind in rapid succession. Would it come closer to the house? Could it peer into my window if it wanted to? Did it know I was watching? Was it intelligent enough to understand what a house was, what it contained? The uncertainty was almost worse than direct confrontation would have been. I had never felt so vulnerable, pressed into the creaking springs of my own bed like a frightened child hiding from the monster in the closet. Except this monster was real, and it was standing in my backyard, and no amount of reasoning or adult reassurance could make it go away. Outside, the figure moved again, its massive form disappearing behind the angled slope of the hill that led down to the state forest. I wanted to feel relief, but instead I was gripped by a new fear. What if it was circling around? What if it knew exactly where I was and was simply choosing its approach? I lay there in the darkness, completely motionless, praying to God that it would keep going, that it would return to whatever dark corner of the wilderness it called home. My muscles ached from tension, and I realized I was holding my breath without meaning to. The urge to leap up and run to my parents' room battled with the primal instinct to remain absolutely still and silent. Minutes crawled by like hours. The old house settled around me with its usual collection of pops and creaks, but now every sound seemed amplified and threatening. A branch scratched against the window, and I nearly screamed before recognizing the familiar noise. My nervous system was so overloaded that I was jumping at shadows. After what felt like an eternity, the normal sounds of night gradually returned. A frog began croaking somewhere near the stream that ran behind the barn. An owl hooted in the distance. These ordinary noises should have been comforting, but instead they felt like a mockery of the terror I'd just experienced. Still, I stayed pinned in place, afraid to move, afraid to breathe too loudly, afraid that any sign of life from my window might bring the creature back. Dawn eventually crept in through the glass, orange light stretching across the floor like searching fingers. Only then did I dare to shift position, my body aching from being tensed for hours. When I finally looked outside in the growing daylight, the pasture appeared completely normal. The fence was intact, the road was empty, and there was no sign that anything unusual had ever been there. But I knew what I had seen, and no amount of morning sunshine could erase the memory of that towering silhouette moving across my family's land with impossible grace. The morning after my window sighting, I tried one last desperate time to convince my parents that something far more dangerous than any bear was roaming our property. I described the creature's impossible height, its otherworldly movement, the way it had seemed to glide across the road rather than walk. I begged them to take me seriously, to at least consider the possibility that we were dealing with something beyond normal wildlife. My mother cut me off with that same patient smile, telling me to worry less about monsters and more about my chores. My father, equally skeptical, suggested I pack some pepper spray if I was so nervous about going outside. The dismissal was maddening. Here I was, providing eyewitness testimony to something extraordinary and terrifying, and they were treating me like a child afraid of the dark. "You're getting worked up over nothing," Dad said, not even looking up from his morning coffee. "There's nothing out there that can't be explained by normal wildlife behavior. Maybe you saw a bull moose. They can get pretty big." But I knew what a moose looked like, and this hadn't been anything like that. The proportions were all wrong, the movement too fluid, too purposeful. No known animal moved the way this thing had moved. Only Marcus believed me, and that was mostly because he'd been there in the alder grove when the forest had erupted with that terrifying roar. Even then, I sensed a flicker of doubt in his eyes, like he wondered if maybe I was exaggerating the nighttime sighting to match the trauma of our earlier encounter. "I mean, it was dark," he said tentatively. "Maybe it just looked bigger than it really was. Shadows can play tricks on you." But I knew what I had seen. The moonlight had been bright enough to reveal details, and there was no mistaking the creature's enormous size. Still, I couldn't blame Marcus for his skepticism. What I was describing sounded impossible even to me. I couldn't let it go. Every trip to the barn, every trek to the far pasture, I found myself scanning the tree line for anything out of place. My eyes searched constantly for broken branches, unusual tracks, any sign that something large had passed through. The normal rhythm of farm life became secondary to my obsessive vigilance. At night, I would lie awake listening for heavy footsteps or another earth-shaking roar. Every creak of the house, every sound from outside, sent adrenaline shooting through my system. My grades began to suffer as exhaustion took its toll. But I couldn't force myself to sleep while that thing might be prowling around our property. When Marcus finally admitted that he was tired of tossing and turning himself, we made a pact to figure out what was happening once and for all. We couldn't live in this state of constant dread, jumping at every shadow, afraid to venture outside after dark. We needed answers, even if those answers were terrifying. We waited until the moon rose high again, just shy of full, casting that eerie silver light across the landscape. Under the cover of darkness, we snuck out of the house with an old flashlight Dad used for farm work and a hand-me-down camera we'd borrowed from our grandmother. Our plan was simple. Stake out the edge of the property line near the dirt road, where I'd last seen that colossal figure. The night was cold enough to sting our lungs when we breathed, and the air felt heavy with the kind of tension that precedes a thunderstorm. Beyond the faint ring of our flashlight's beam, the world was a black canvas punctuated only by the distant glow of stars. Even the barn, usually a comforting sight that spoke of home and safety, looked like a looming shape of wooden slats and rusted metal. We positioned ourselves behind a cluster of old oak trees that provided both concealment and a clear view of the road. The waiting was excruciating. Every minute that passed felt like an hour, and I began to wonder if we were on a fool's errand. Maybe the creature only appeared randomly. Maybe it had moved on to some other territory. At first we heard only the familiar sounds of night, the hum of crickets, the distant call of an owl, the soft lowing of cattle in the upper pasture. Then, just as I was starting to think nothing would happen, a low, resonant thump reached our ears. The sound was like nothing I'd ever heard before. Not quite footsteps, not quite the crash of falling trees, but something in between. It seemed to come from deep within the forest, but with each repetition it grew closer. Marcus grabbed my arm, his fingers digging into my flesh with desperate strength. The thumping had a rhythm to it, like the measured gait of something enormous walking through the undergrowth. Between each impact, we could hear the snap and crash of branches being pushed aside or trampled underfoot. Whatever was making the sound was big enough that trees weren't obstacles. They were annoyances to be brushed away. The cattle in the upper pasture began to move restlessly, their peaceful grazing replaced by nervous shuffling and anxious moos. They sensed something was wrong, some primitive part of their brains recognizing the presence of a predator. Their distress calls echoed across the property, adding to the growing sense of impending doom. Marcus fumbled with the flashlight, his hands shaking so badly he nearly dropped it. In that half-second of wild swinging light, before he managed to switch it off again, I spotted a hulking outline at the far end of the pasture. It was partially masked by shadow, but there was no mistaking the massive shoulders, the impossible height, the sense of barely contained power. The thing stood motionless for a moment, as if it had sensed our light and was trying to locate its source. Then it took a step forward, and the ground seemed to vibrate under its weight. Another step, and I could hear the wet squelch of mud being compressed under enormous feet. That's when it roared. The sound was exactly like what we'd heard in the alder grove, but somehow worse because we could see its source. The roar seemed to come from the very depths of hell, a noise so primal and filled with rage that it bypassed rational thought and spoke directly to the part of our brains that still remembered being prey. The sound waves hit us like a physical force, making our chests vibrate and our ears ring. I felt it in my bones, in my teeth, in every cell of my body. It was a sound that spoke of hunger and violence and intelligence, a combination that should have been impossible but was standing right there in front of us. Marcus yanked me backward, and we sprinted for the house without looking back. My feet barely registered the ground beneath them. I expected to feel hot breath at my back, or sense the pounding of massive footsteps in pursuit. But that didn't happen. The creature seemed content to watch us flee, its message delivered. Once we reached the porch, we dared to glance over our shoulders. The pasture lay still and dark, though the cattle were still agitated, their nervous calls drifting across the property. The creature, if it had followed at all, had melted back into the darkness from which it came. We never spoke of what happened that night to our parents. They wouldn't have believed us anyway, and we'd learned that some truths are too large for small minds to accept. Instead, we settled into an unspoken understanding with whatever shared our land. Over the years that followed, I caught glimpses of it from time to time. Always at night, always at a distance, always just long enough to remind me that we weren't alone out there. The sightings became less frequent as I grew older, as if the thing had decided I was no longer a threat, or perhaps no longer interesting. Now, as an adult with children of my own, I sometimes wonder if I should warn them about what lurks beyond the tree line. But part of me thinks that some knowledge is better discovered on its own, when the mind is ready to accept that the world contains mysteries that science cannot explain. I still live on the old property, though I've built a new house closer to the road. Sometimes, on nights when the moon is full and the air is crisp with autumn promise, I stand at my window and listen. And sometimes, if I'm very quiet and very patient, I can hear it out there. The sound of something massive moving through the forest, reminding me that humans are not the only intelligent species that calls this place home. The land holds its secrets well, and I've learned to respect the boundaries of what should remain unknown. Some mysteries are meant to stay mysterious, and some truths are too terrible for the daylight world to acknowledge. But they exist nonetheless, prowling the edges of our understanding, waiting for those brave or foolish enough to seek them out. That thing is still out there, somewhere beyond Rattlesnake Ridge, and I've made my peace with sharing this world with forces I'll never fully understand. It's taught me humility, shown me that humans are not the masters of everything we survey. And perhaps that's a lesson worth learning, even if it comes wrapped in terror and sleepless nights. The story ends where it began, with the knowledge that our safe, predictable world is far stranger and more dangerous than we dare imagine. And sometimes, late at night when the wind howls through the trees. I'm grateful for that knowledge, even as it fills me with a fear that will never completely fade. I never believed in ghost stories or things that lurked in darkness. Growing up in a forgotten corner of Utah, you learn that the vast landscape plays cruel tricks on the mind. Our house occupied the final boundary where civilization surrendered to wilderness, a thin line drawn in dirt and broken dreams. Behind our weathered fence stretched an endless field of scrub brush and alkaline soil, extending toward distant mountains that appeared to float like mirages in the desert heat. On windless afternoons, dust devils would materialize from nothing, spinning across the barren earth with an intelligence that made my stomach tighten with unease. The sensation of living at the world's edge never left me. Beyond our property lay only emptiness, no roads, no buildings, just the kind of desolation that swallows sound and leaves you questioning whether you truly exist. My closest neighbor, Benedict, lived in the house next door, though next door meant across 50 yards of wild grass and scattered stones. Our homes marked the absolute terminus of Sagebrush Lane, a street that ended in an unfinished cul-de-sac. The city had planned expansion decades ago, carving the circular road into hard-packed earth before abandoning the project entirely. That empty circle of asphalt became a monument to forgotten ambitions, cracking under relentless sun and winter frost. Benedict's basement served as our refuge during those long summer days of 2020. The space contained little more than a sagging couch, a television that flickered between channels without warning, and a small refrigerator that hummed with mechanical distress. A single window well provided the only natural light, a rectangular portal that revealed nothing but weeds and sky during daylight hours. When darkness fell, that same window transformed into something menacing. The glass reflected only black void, creating the impression that we were being watched by invisible eyes. Neither Benedict nor I acknowledged this feeling aloud, but we both began avoiding that side of the basement after sunset. The first disturbance came on a Tuesday night in late June. We were deep into a gaming session, controllers clicking furiously, when a sound drifted through the window, a slow, deliberate scraping accompanied by wet, gurgling breaths. The noise lasted perhaps 10 seconds before fading into silence. We paused our game, exchanging glances that conveyed shared unease. Benedict suggested it might be a stray dog, or perhaps a raccoon searching for food. I agreed quickly, eager to accept any rational explanation. But something about the rhythmic nature of the scraping troubled me. Animals move with purpose or panic. This sound carried neither urgency nor randomness. Over the following weeks, the disturbances became routine. Always at night, always the same combination of scraping and that horrible wet breathing. We developed the habit of turning up the television volume whenever the sounds began, drowning them out with artificial noise. Yet even through the electronic chatter, we could sense movement outside that window. One evening, driven by curiosity stronger than fear, we aimed flashlights through the glass. The beams revealed nothing but empty ground and scattered weeds, yet shadows seemed to shift at the edges of illumination. The next morning, we searched for tracks in the soft earth around the window well, finding only smooth soil marked by random patches of scrub grass. The absence of evidence disturbed me more than footprints would have. Something was creating those sounds, yet leaving no trace of its presence. Logic demanded an explanation that my mind refused to provide. As July melted into August, the atmosphere around our homes began to change. The air felt heavier during daylight hours, as if the field itself was holding secrets just beneath its surface. When wind moved through the low bushes, the rustling sounded less like nature and more like whispered conversations in a language I couldn't understand. Benedict received news that his family would relocate to Salt Lake City before school resumed. The announcement hit me like a physical blow, not just the loss of my best friend, but the prospect of facing whatever lurked beyond that window alone. We spent our remaining weeks together with desperate intensity, as if constant activity could prevent the inevitable separation. During those final days, both of us noticed changes in our surroundings that we couldn't explain. The streetlight at the cul-de-sac's entrance flickered erratically before dying completely, leaving that end of the road in absolute darkness. Utility workers came twice to replace the bulb, but it failed again within hours each time. Eventually, they stopped trying. The broken light created a pool of impenetrable shadow that seemed to expand each night, creeping closer to our houses like spilled ink. Standing on Benedict's back porch after sunset became an exercise in controlled terror. The darkness felt alive, pressing against the edges of our property with malevolent purpose. I began experiencing what I convinced myself were stress dreams, visions of pale figures moving through the field under starlight, their limbs bending at impossible angles as they navigated the rough terrain. In these dreams, the figures never approached our houses directly, but circled them in widening spirals, as if testing invisible barriers. Benedict confided that he was having similar dreams, though he described the figures differently. In his version, they walked upright like humans but cast no shadows, their faces featureless except for dark hollows where eyes should be. We agreed these were just manifestations of our anxiety about his impending move, but the dreams felt too vivid to dismiss entirely. The sounds from the window well grew more frequent and varied. Along with the familiar scraping, we now heard what sounded like fingernails dragging across glass, followed by periods of absolute silence that felt more threatening than any noise. On several occasions, we thought we glimpsed pale shapes pressing against the window from outside, but when we looked directly, nothing was there. Sleep became elusive for both of us. We took turns staying awake, ostensibly to keep watch, though neither admitted what we were watching for. During these long vigils, the basement felt like a submarine trapped beneath an ocean of malevolent darkness. Every creak of the house above us might signal the presence we dreaded finally finding a way inside. Benedict's mother began expressing concern about our haggard appearances and sluggish behavior. She attributed our condition to summer laziness and typical teenage moodiness, never suspecting that terror was slowly consuming us from within. We maintained facades of normalcy during family dinners and daytime activities, saving our fears for the basement's artificial twilight. 3 days before Benedict's departure, the disturbances reached a new level of intensity. We were attempting to watch a late-night movie when the scraping sounds began earlier than usual, barely past 10 o'clock. But this time, the noise didn't come from the window well. It seemed to originate from multiple locations around the house, as if several creatures were testing different approaches. The scratching moved along the basement's foundation walls in a deliberate pattern, starting at the window and progressing methodically around the perimeter. We sat frozen on the couch, tracking the sound's progress by ear. When it reached the corner where the water heater stood, the scratching paused for several minutes before resuming with increased urgency. Above us, we heard Benedict's parents moving around the main floor, their footsteps creating a comforting reminder that we weren't entirely alone. Yet their presence also highlighted how isolated we felt in the basement, separated from help by a flight of stairs that suddenly seemed as vast as a canyon. The scratching completed its circuit and returned to the window well, where it was joined by a new sound, rhythmic tapping against the glass, as if something was knocking for entry. The taps came in groups of 3, repeated at regular intervals. We recognized this wasn't random animal behavior, but deliberate communication. Benedict found the courage to creep toward the window, flashlight in hand. I wanted to stop him, but couldn't find my voice. He pressed his face against the glass and aimed the beam upward. For a moment, he remained perfectly still. Then he jerked backward, nearly falling over the coffee table. "What did you see?" I whispered. His face had gone completely white. "There's something up there. At ground level. It was looking down at me." We spent the rest of the night huddled together on the couch, every light in the basement blazing. The scratching and tapping continued until dawn, growing more insistent as the hours passed. By sunrise, we were both exhausted and terrified, but the arrival of daylight brought immediate relief. Whatever haunted the darkness couldn't tolerate direct sunlight. Over the next 2 days, we avoided the basement entirely. Benedict focused on packing while I helped his family load their belongings. The physical activity provided welcome distraction from our shared dread, though I noticed both of us glancing frequently toward the empty field, as if expecting to see evidence of our nocturnal visitors. On Benedict's final evening, we sat on his front porch, watching the sun disappear behind the western mountains. The approaching darkness filled me with familiar anxiety, but I was determined to maintain composure for his sake. We talked about staying in touch, about visits during school breaks, about anything except the terror that had dominated our summer. As stars appeared overhead, the streetlight at the cul-de-sac's end flickered briefly before dying again. The expanding pool of shadow seemed to pulse with anticipation, as if whatever lived in the field was preparing for something significant. Benedict's departure would leave me alone to face whatever came next, and both of us understood this without speaking. "Maybe you should ask your parents about staying somewhere else for a while," Benedict suggested quietly. I nodded, though we both knew I had nowhere to go. My family had lived in this house for generations. Running away would only delay the inevitable confrontation. Whatever shared the field with us had been patient so far, but patience has limits. 2 weeks after Benedict left, I couldn't bear the isolation any longer. The basement had become unbearable. Every shadow concealed potential threats. Every sound from outside sent waves of terror through my chest. I needed to face whatever was tormenting me, or madness would claim me first. On a moonless night in early September, I gathered every flashlight in our house and prepared for a confrontation I'd been dreading all summer. My parents were visiting relatives in Provo, leaving me alone with whatever inhabited the darkness beyond our fence. The timing felt predetermined, as if the creatures had been waiting for this exact moment of vulnerability. I dressed in heavy boots and dark clothing, reasoning that if I needed to run, I should be prepared for rough terrain. 3 flashlights went into my jacket pockets, along with my father's heavy camping knife. The blade provided minimal comfort, but holding something solid helped control my shaking hands. The back door opened with a creak that seemed to echo across the empty field. Cool air carried scents of sage and dust, mixed with something else. A sweetly rotten odor that made my stomach clench with revulsion. I stepped onto the porch and immediately felt eyes watching me from the darkness. The broken streetlight meant the cul-de-sac existed in absolute blackness. My primary flashlight beam barely penetrated 20 feet before being swallowed by the void. I walked slowly across our backyard, each step deliberate and measured. The familiar terrain felt foreign under the weight of terror and anticipation. At the fence line, I paused to gather courage for what came next. Beyond this barrier lay unknown territory, where normal rules might not apply. The scratching sounds that had plagued our basement emanated from this field. Whatever made them was waiting among the brush and shadow. I climbed over the fence and dropped into the field proper. The ground felt soft beneath my boots, as if the soil was somehow different here than in our yard. My flashlight swept left and right, revealing only scrub grass and scattered stones. Yet I sensed movement at the edges of perception, shapes that vanished whenever I turned toward them directly. The silence was complete except for my own breathing and the soft crunch of vegetation underfoot. No insects chirped, no small animals rustled through the brush. The field existed in a bubble of unnatural quiet that made every sound I created seem amplified and threatening. I walked toward the center of the empty space, flashlight beam dancing nervously across the terrain. My goal was simple: find evidence of whatever had been tormenting me, or prove to myself that fear had created imaginary monsters. Either outcome would provide relief from the uncertainty that was slowly destroying my sanity. When I reached what felt like the field's midpoint, I stopped and turned in a slow circle, illuminating the area systematically. The beam revealed nothing unusual, just more scrub and stone scattered across alkaline soil. But as I completed the rotation, something moved in my peripheral vision. I spun toward the movement and found myself face to face with the most terrifying sight of my life. The creature stood 15 feet away, just at the edge of my flashlight's beam. Its form was vaguely humanoid, but wrong in every possible way. The body was impossibly thin, as if someone had stretched a normal person to twice their natural height while keeping the same mass. Pale skin clung to visible bones, creating valleys and ridges that caught the light in nauseating ways. Arms and legs bent at joints where humans had none, creating a spider-like articulation that allowed movement in directions anatomy should prohibit. The fingers were twice normal length, ending in what looked like black claws that scraped together with metallic sounds. Each digit moved independently, creating a constant writhing motion that made my vision blur with vertigo. But the head was the most disturbing feature. The skull was elongated vertically, rising to a point that disappeared into shadow above my light's reach. Where a face should be, I saw only smooth skin broken by a horizontal gash that served as a mouth. The opening stretched far wider than human anatomy allowed, revealing not teeth, but a dark void that seemed to absorb light. Eyes were completely absent, replaced by shallow depressions in the pale flesh. Yet I felt certain the creature was aware of my presence, studying me with senses I couldn't comprehend. The lack of visible eyes somehow made its attention more terrifying than any stare could be. The creature remained motionless for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. During this frozen moment, I became aware of other presences in the field, similar shapes moving at the periphery of my vision, circling my position like predators evaluating prey. The realization that I was surrounded by these things sent ice through my veins. Then the primary creature moved. Its limbs unfolded with fluid grace that defied the angular joints, carrying it several steps closer in complete silence. The mouth gash opened wider, releasing a sound that was part exhale and part whispered word in a language that predated human speech. The noise seemed to vibrate inside my skull, causing physical pain behind my eyes. Other creatures responded with similar sounds from multiple directions around me. The field filled with their alien chorus, a symphony of whispers and exhales that created harmonies no earthly throat could produce. The sounds bypassed my ears entirely, resonating directly in my bones and organs, with frequencies that human physiology wasn't designed to process. I tried to step backward but found my legs frozen with terror. The camping knife in my pocket felt absurdly inadequate against beings that moved like liquid shadow and sang with voices from nightmare. My flashlight beam trembled violently, creating a strobe effect that made the creature's movements appear even more unnatural. The thing extended one impossibly long arm toward me, fingers writhing like independent serpents. As it reached closer, I caught the source of that sickly sweet rotting odor. The creature's skin wept a clear fluid that reflected my flashlight beam with oily rainbows. The smell intensified as more liquid dripped from its pale flesh onto the ground between us. When those extended fingers were within inches of my face, some survival instinct finally broke through the paralysis of terror. I stumbled backward, nearly falling but managing to keep the flashlight trained on the creature. It didn't pursue immediately, but tilted its head with curiosity that somehow seemed more threatening than aggression. The gesture was almost human in its familiarity, yet coming from this abomination it became mockery of everything human gestures represented. This thing was studying me, learning from my reactions, perhaps deciding whether I was worth the effort of hunting. The possibility that it viewed me as nothing more than mild entertainment filled me with rage that temporarily overcame fear. Rage proved to be my salvation. Instead of continuing my retreat, I raised the flashlight higher and shouted every curse I could remember. The sudden noise and light seemed to surprise the creature, causing it to pull back its extended arm with lightning speed. For the first time since the encounter began, I felt a flicker of control over the situation. "Stay back," I screamed, though I doubted it understood English. "Get away from me." The creature's mouth gash widened further, releasing more of those bone-deep whispers. But now the sound carried a different quality. Not the predatory evaluation of before, but something closer to amusement. It was enjoying my terror, feeding off the fear that radiated from every pore of my body. Other creatures emerged from concealment around me, their pale forms catching fragmentary light as they moved through the brush. I counted at least 6, possibly more lurking beyond my flashlight's reach. They formed a loose circle, not closing distance but preventing any easy escape route toward my house. The primary creature took another step forward, its clawed feet making no sound despite the rough terrain. This close, I could see details that my mind struggled to process. The pale skin wasn't smooth but covered in tiny scales that shifted color depending on the angle of light. What I had taken for bones visible beneath the flesh were actually some kind of external plating, like armor grown from within. Most disturbing were the constant movements beneath the skin, shapes that pressed against the flesh from inside, creating rolling bulges that traveled up and down its limbs. Something lived inside these creatures, and I didn't want to discover what it might be. My second flashlight was in my left pocket. I managed to extract it without taking my eyes off the primary creature, then clicked it on and aimed it toward the circle of surrounding figures. The additional light revealed the true extent of my predicament. At least 10 creatures had emerged from hiding, all focused on my position with that terrible eyeless attention. They began moving in unison, not approaching but shifting position to maintain the circle as I turned to track them. The coordination was perfect, as if they shared a collective intelligence that allowed instantaneous communication. When one moved left, another adjusted right to compensate. When I focused my lights on a particular individual, the others would shift to maintain optimal positioning. This was pack hunting behavior, refined by intelligence far beyond animal cunning. They were herding me toward some predetermined location, probably the center of the field where escape would be impossible. Once they had me positioned exactly where they wanted, the real nightmare would begin. I broke for the gap between 2 creatures, sprinting toward what I hoped was home. My boots found loose stones and twisted beneath me, but adrenaline kept me upright and running. Behind me, the whisper song rose to a crescendo that made my teeth ache with sympathetic vibration. The creatures didn't pursue with obvious speed, but somehow they kept pace without apparent effort. When I glanced back, they seemed to be flowing across the terrain rather than running, their bizarre joints allowing movement that resembled swimming through air. Worst of all, they were silent. No breathing, no footfalls, just the continued whisper song that followed me like audible shadow. My house appeared ahead, blessed rectangles of light from windows I'd left burning. The fence line was 30 yards away, then 20, then 10. I leaped at the barrier and scrambled over with desperate strength, falling hard onto familiar grass on the other side. The whisper song stopped abruptly. When I turned back toward the field, flashlight beams searching frantically, I saw nothing but empty scrubland under starlight. The creatures had vanished as completely as if they'd never existed, leaving me gasping and shaking in my own backyard. The encounter left me fundamentally changed. Sleep became nearly impossible. Whenever I closed my eyes, I saw those pale forms circling me in the darkness, heard the bone-deep whispers that seemed to promise future encounters. During daylight hours, I felt relatively safe, but sunset brought waves of terror that no amount of rational thinking could dispel. I called Benedict several times, desperate to share the experience with someone who might understand. But describing the creatures felt impossible. Words couldn't convey the way they moved, the intelligence behind their eyeless attention, or the feeling that they were studying me for purposes I couldn't comprehend. Benedict listened patiently, but I could hear skepticism growing in his voice with each conversation. My parents returned from Provo to find me haggard and jumpy, unable to concentrate on simple tasks or maintain normal conversation. When they asked about my condition, I claimed to be coming down with a flu bug. The lie came easily, but I knew they were growing concerned about my increasingly erratic behavior. School would start in 2 weeks, which should have provided welcome distraction from my obsession with the field. Instead, the approaching deadline filled me with dread. How could I focus on classes and homework while knowing those creatures were waiting beyond our fence? How could I pretend normalcy when every sunset brought the possibility of another encounter? The scratching sounds returned to the basement window well, now accompanied by what sounded like multiple creatures testing the glass for weaknesses. I avoided the basement entirely, spending evenings in my upstairs bedroom with every light burning. But even there, I felt their presence in the field, patient and watchful. 3 nights after the encounter, I woke to find my bedroom window screen had been removed and was lying on the floor. The window itself remained closed and locked, but something had worked the screen loose from outside. My room was on the 2nd floor. Nothing human could have reached that window without a ladder. I replaced the screen and added additional locks to the window, but the message was clear. The creatures weren't confined to ground level, and physical barriers provided only minimal protection. They could reach me anywhere in the house if they chose to do so. The knowledge that I was being hunted by things that could climb walls and remove screens without sound filled me with despair that bordered on breakdown. My father noticed me checking door and window locks obsessively, but attributed the behavior to teenage anxiety about starting senior year. If only he knew the real reason for my paranoia, that inhuman predators were testing our home's defenses, looking for the perfect opportunity to finish whatever they'd started in the field. The whisper song began appearing in my dreams, those bone-deep harmonies that spoke in languages older than human civilization. In these nightmares, I understood fragments of their meaning. They were calling to others of their kind, reporting on my location and vulnerability. More were coming, drawn by the promise of prey that had escaped their initial hunt. During one particularly vivid dream, I found myself standing in the field again, but this time dozens of the pale creatures surrounded me in concentric circles. They weren't hunting anymore. They were performing some kind of ritual, their whisper song rising and falling in complex patterns that made the air itself vibrate with malevolent energy. I woke from that dream to find scratches on my arms that hadn't been there when I went to bed. The marks were precise and deliberate, forming patterns that reminded me uncomfortably of the creature's scaled skin. Either I was injuring myself during sleep, or something was finding ways to reach me even inside the house. 2 days before school began, the situation reached its inevitable climax. I was in the kitchen preparing a late dinner when every light in the house went out simultaneously. The power outage wasn't limited to our home. Looking through the windows revealed that the entire neighborhood had gone dark, including the distant glow of the town beyond. But this wasn't a normal blackout. The darkness felt solid, pressing against the windows like liquid shadow trying to flow inside. My flashlight beam seemed weaker than usual, barely penetrating a few feet before being absorbed by the unnatural gloom that had settled over everything. The whisper song began immediately, rising from the field, in harmonies so complex they hurt to hear. But now the sound wasn't distant. It surrounded the house, coming from all directions as if the creatures had taken positions in our yard. They had been patient for weeks, studying my routines and the house's vulnerabilities. Tonight was their night to finish whatever they had planned. I grabbed the camping knife and my remaining flashlights, knowing they would provide little protection but needing to hold something solid. The sounds outside were changing, becoming more urgent and excited. Whatever ritual they were performing was reaching its conclusion, and I was the focal point of their attention. Glass shattered somewhere in the house. probably the basement window finally giving way under their persistent scratching. I heard movement below me. The sound of multiple bodies flowing through spaces too small for normal anatomy. They were inside now, and hiding was no longer an option. The basement stairs creaked under weight that seemed far heavier than the creature's skeletal frames should carry. They were ascending slowly, savoring the anticipation of our final meeting. The whisper song grew louder as they approached, filling the house with harmonies that made the walls themselves vibrate in sympathy. I positioned myself in the living room, back against the far wall, both flashlights trained on the hallway entrance. Whatever came through that doorway would face at least token resistance. The knife felt pathetic in my shaking hand, but determination was all I had left. The first creature appeared in the beam of my lights, its impossible height forcing it to bend nearly in half to fit through the normal-sized doorway. Behind it, I glimpsed others waiting their turn to enter. They had all night, and patience was clearly one of their virtues. But as the creature straightened to its full height in the living room, something unexpected happened. The electric power returned suddenly, flooding the house with normal artificial light. The creature froze in apparent confusion, its pale skin seeming to smoke where the overhead fixtures hit it directly. It made a sound I hadn't heard before. Not the whisper song, but a shriek of genuine distress. The thing stumbled backward, colliding with others still in the hallway. They began retreating immediately, flowing back toward the basement with the same fluid grace they'd used to enter. Within seconds, the house was empty except for myself and the lingering smell of that sickly sweet fluid they secreted. I heard the basement window screen being replaced from outside, followed by rapidly fading whisper song as they returned to the field. The power outage had been their doing somehow, creating the darkness they needed to enter human habitation. But they couldn't maintain the effect indefinitely, and normal light caused them genuine harm. I had learned something crucial about their limitations. Over the following weeks, as school began and routine gradually returned to my life, the creatures made no further attempts to approach the house. They remained in the field, patient as ever, but something had changed in their behavior. Perhaps they recognized that I now understood their weakness, or perhaps the failed raid had consequences in whatever hierarchy governed their species. I never saw them again, though I knew they were still there. On clear nights, I could sometimes hear fragments of their whisper song carried on desert winds. When I graduated the following spring and left for college, that sound was the last thing I heard as I drove away from the house where I'd learned that darkness holds terrors beyond human imagination. Years have passed since then, but I still check my locks obsessively and sleep with multiple light sources within reach. Some knowledge once gained can never be forgotten. And somewhere in that Utah field, patient creatures still wait in the darkness, their whisper song calling to others of their kind, preparing for the night when the lights go out and don't come back on. Joel Lasker stared at his computer screen, the lines of code blurring together as fatigue set in. It was past midnight, and the harsh glow of the monitor was the only light in his cramped studio apartment. Empty energy drink cans and takeout containers littered his desk, testament to another week of grueling work and minimal self-care. He rubbed his eyes, feeling the weight of exhaustion pressing down on him. It had been months since his breakup with Sarah, and the sting of it still lingered. Work had become his escape, a way to avoid dealing with the emptiness that seemed to fill every corner of his life. But now, even that felt suffocating. The deadline for his current project loomed over him like a dark cloud. In just a few days, he'd have to present a fully functional prototype to the client, and he was nowhere near ready. The pressure was crushing, and for the first time in his career, Joel found himself questioning whether he could deliver. As he scrolled through his social media feed, seeking a momentary distraction, an ad caught his eye. It showed a gleaming RV parked beside a serene lake, surrounded by towering pines. "Escape the grind," the tagline read, Rent an RV and rediscover nature. Joel snorted. Nature had never been his thing. Growing up in the heart of Chicago, his idea of the great outdoors was the small park down the street. Camping, hiking, those were activities for other people, the kind who wore flannel unironically and knew how to start a fire without a lighter. But as he stared at the image, something stirred within him. The idea of getting away, of leaving behind the noise and chaos of the city, suddenly seemed incredibly appealing. No deadlines, no ex-girlfriends, no reminders of his failures, just open road and wilderness. Before he could talk himself out of it, Joel clicked on the ad. 30 minutes later, he had booked an RV for the upcoming weekend. His destination? Black River National Forest, a place he'd never heard of before but seemed perfectly isolated. As he finally crawled into bed, a mix of excitement and anxiety swirled in his chest. What the hell had he just done? He didn't know the first thing about RVs or camping. This could be a complete disaster. But as sleep began to overtake him, Joel couldn't help but smile. For the first time in months, he had something to look forward to. Something that wasn't work or wallowing in self-pity. Maybe, just maybe, this impulsive decision would be exactly what he needed. Little did Joel know, as he drifted off to sleep, that his weekend getaway would become far more than a simple escape from the daily grind. The forests of Black River held secrets darker and more terrifying than he could ever imagine, and his journey into their depths would change him forever. Friday afternoon arrived with a sense of nervous anticipation. Joel stood in front of his closet, realizing he owned nothing remotely suitable for a camping trip. His wardrobe consisted mainly of jeans, t-shirts, and the occasional button-down for client meetings. After some deliberation, he threw a mix of comfortable clothes into his duffel bag, along with a light jacket he'd rarely worn. A quick stop at a nearby outdoor supply store left him with a basic first aid kit, a flashlight, and a Swiss Army knife he wasn't entirely sure how to use. The salesperson had tried to convince him to buy more gear, but Joel's budget was already stretched thin by the RV rental. As he made his way to the rental agency, doubt began to creep in. What if he couldn't figure out how to operate the RV? What if he got lost? What if... Mr. Lasker? A cheerful voice interrupted his spiraling thoughts. A young woman with a clipboard stood before him, her name tag identifying her as Ashley. Are you ready for your adventure? Joel managed a weak smile. As ready as I'll ever be, I guess. Ashley led him to a gleaming white RV that looked impossibly large. This is the Forest River R-Pod 189. It's perfect for first-time RVers. Let me show you around. The next hour was a whirlwind of information. Ashley patiently explained how to operate everything from the generator to the toilet. Joel nodded along, trying to absorb it all, while feeling increasingly overwhelmed. And remember, Ashley said as she handed him the keys, there's a manual in the glove compartment if you forget anything. Do you have any questions? Joel had about 1,000 questions, but he couldn't articulate any of them. I think I'm good, he lied. Great. Have a wonderful trip, and don't hesitate to call if you need anything. As Ashley walked away, Joel climbed into the driver's seat, his palms sweaty. He took a deep breath, started the engine, and slowly pulled out of the lot. The RV felt enormous, and he gripped the wheel tightly, hyper-aware of every movement. The first hour of the drive was tense. Joel flinched every time a car passed him, certain he was about to sideswipe someone. But as the city gave way to suburbs, and suburbs to countryside, he began to relax. The RV handled better than he expected, and the open road ahead filled him with a sense of freedom he hadn't felt in years. As he crossed into Michigan, Joel's thoughts turned to Black River National Forest. He'd done some cursory research before leaving, but information had been sparse. It wasn't a well-known park, which suited Joel just fine. He wanted solitude, a chance to clear his head without the distraction of other people. The sun was setting as Joel turned onto the winding road that led into the forest. The trees seemed to close in around him, their branches reaching out over the road like grasping fingers. The fading light cast long shadows, creating a world of shifting darkness that made Joel's skin prickle with unease. He consulted the map he'd printed out, searching for the campsite he'd identified earlier. It was off the main road, near a small lake that had looked picturesque in the satellite images. As he turned onto a narrow dirt path, the RV bounced and jolted, making Joel wince at every bump. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of careful maneuvering, the trees opened up to reveal a small clearing next to a still, dark lake. Joel parked the RV, his hands shaking slightly as he turned off the engine. For a moment, he sat in silence, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the forest at night. It was beautiful, in a primal, slightly unsettling way. The moon reflected off the lake's surface, creating a silvery mirror that seemed to stretch into infinity. The trees loomed tall and ancient, their leaves rustling in a gentle breeze that carried the scent of pine and damp earth. As Joel stepped out of the RV, the enormity of his situation hit him. He was alone, miles from civilization, in a place he knew nothing about. The weight of the silence pressed in on him, broken only by the occasional hoot of an owl or the rustling of some unseen creature in the underbrush. For a brief, panicked moment, Joel considered getting back in the RV and driving home. But as he stood there, breathing in the crisp night air, a sense of calm began to settle over him. This was why he had come, wasn't it? To get away from everything, to find some peace in the solitude of nature. With renewed determination, Joel set about making camp. He fumbled with the RV's systems, eventually managing to extend the awning and set up a small folding table and chair. As he worked, the familiar motions of setting up his temporary home helped ease his anxiety. By the time he had a small fire going in the designated pit, Joel felt a sense of accomplishment he hadn't experienced in months. He sat in his chair, a can of beer in hand, and gazed out at the lake. The flames cast a warm glow, creating a small circle of light that held the darkness at bay. As he sat there, Joel felt the tension of the past few months begin to melt away. The deadline, the breakup, the suffocating feeling of being trapped in a life he wasn't sure he wanted anymore. All of it seemed distant and unimportant in the face of this vast, indifferent wilderness. Little did Joel know, as he drifted off to sleep that night in the unfamiliar confines of the RV, that his weekend of peaceful solitude was about to take a turn into territory darker and more terrifying than he could have ever imagined. The true nature of Black River National Forest and the secrets it held were waiting to be revealed. Joel woke early the next morning, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings. Sunlight filtered through the RV's curtains, casting a warm glow over the compact interior. As the events of the previous day came flooding back, a mixture of excitement and apprehension filled him. He stepped outside, inhaling deeply. The morning air was crisp and clean, filled with the scent of pine and damp earth. The lake stretched out before him, its surface like glass, perfectly reflecting the sky and surrounding trees. It was a scene of such serene beauty that Joel felt a twinge of regret for all the years he'd spent cooped up in the city, oblivious to the natural wonders that existed beyond its borders. After a simple breakfast of instant coffee and granola bars, Joel decided to explore his surroundings. He'd seen a faint trail leading into the woods during his drive in, and it seemed like a good place to start. Grabbing his backpack, which he'd hastily stuffed with water, snacks, and his new first aid kit, Joel set off. The trail was little more than a game path, barely visible in some places. Joel found himself having to push through undergrowth and step over fallen logs. Despite the difficulty, he felt a growing sense of exhilaration. This was real wilderness, untamed and unexplored. As he ventured deeper into the forest, Joel noticed the quality of light changing. The canopy above grew denser, allowing only dappled sunlight to reach the forest floor. The air grew cooler, and the sounds of the forest seemed to intensify. Birds called to each other in the branches above, while unseen creatures rustled in the underbrush. After about an hour of hiking, Joel came across a small clearing. Sunlight streamed down through a break in the canopy, illuminating a carpet of wildflowers. It was a scene of such unexpected beauty that Joel found himself transfixed. He sat down on a fallen log, pulling out his phone to take a picture, only to remember there was no signal out here. Instead, he simply sat, absorbing the peaceful atmosphere. As he rested, Joel's mind wandered to the work he'd left behind. The deadline that had seemed so insurmountable now felt distant and unimportant. Out here, surrounded by the timeless rhythms of nature, the artificial pressures of his urban life seemed trivial. Lost in thought, Joel almost missed the sound. A crack, like a branch breaking underfoot, somewhere in the trees behind him. He turned, scanning the shadowy forest, but saw nothing. Probably just an animal, he thought. But a prickle of unease ran down his spine. Deciding it was time to head back, Joel stood and consulted his phone's compass. He'd been careful to maintain a straight path, so finding his way back shouldn't be too difficult. As he walked, however, the forest seemed different. The trees looked unfamiliar, the path less clear. Doubt began to creep in. Had he taken a wrong turn? The forest, which had seemed so welcoming earlier, now felt oppressive. The trees seemed to loom over him, their branches reaching out like gnarled hands. The bird calls that had been so melodious before now sounded like mocking laughter. Joel picked up his pace, his heart racing. He was sure the RV should be just ahead, but all he could see were more trees. Panic started to set in. He was lost, alone in an unfamiliar forest with limited supplies. How could he have been so stupid? Just as he was about to give in to full-blown panic, Joel spotted a break in the trees ahead. Relief flooded through him as he pushed forward, expecting to see the welcome sight of his campsite. Instead, what he found made him stop dead in his tracks. The clearing was small, unremarkable except for what lay at its center. At first, Joel thought it was a fallen tree, its trunk massive and covered in dark matted fur. But as his eyes adjusted, he realized he was looking at something else entirely, something that shouldn't exist. The creature, if it could be called that, was enormous, at least 20 feet long, with a body that resembled a bear, but grotesquely oversized. Its limbs were thick as tree trunks, ending in paws the size of car tires, each toe tipped with a claw as long as Joel's forearm. The head was bear-like too, but larger, with a muzzle that seemed almost wolf-like in its elongation. But what truly horrified Joel was the creature's condition. It was dead, that much was clear, but the manner of its death was shocking. Deep gashes ran along its flanks, as if something had torn into it with incredible force. Whatever had killed this monstrous being had to be even more terrifying. Joel stood frozen, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. This thing defied explanation. It was like something out of a nightmare or a cryptozoologist's wildest dreams. Part of him wanted to approach, to touch it, and prove to himself that it was real. But a more primal part of his brain screamed at him to run, to get as far away from this place as possible. In the end, instinct won out. Joel turned and ran, no longer caring about direction or the noise he was making. Branches whipped at his face, roots threatened to trip him, but he kept going. His lungs burned, his legs ached, but the image of that impossible creature drove him on. By some miracle, Joel burst out of the tree line near his campsite. The RV stood there, a beautiful sight of normality and safety. He scrambled inside, slamming and locking the door behind him. Only then, in the familiar confines of the vehicle, did he allow himself to stop and breathe. What had he seen? Was it real, or had the stress and unfamiliar surroundings caused him to hallucinate? Joel's rational mind tried to come up with explanations, but none fit. The memory of those massive claws, the unnatural size of the creature, was too vivid to dismiss. As the adrenaline began to wear off, a new fear set in. If that thing was real, what had killed it? And was it still out there, somewhere in the darkening forest that now seemed infinitely more menacing? Joel peered out the RV's windows, scanning the tree line. The once peaceful forest now seemed full of hidden threats. Every shadow could be hiding something monstrous. Every rustle of leaves could be the approach of an unspeakable horror. As night fell, Joel found himself trapped in a prison of his own making. The RV, which had seemed so spacious before, now felt claustrophobic. But the alternative, going outside, exposing himself to whatever might be lurking in the darkness, was unthinkable. He tried to distract himself, to rationalize away what he'd seen, but the image of that creature was burned into his mind. Sleep, when it finally came, was fitful and filled with nightmares of massive, shadowy forms moving through endless trees. Little did Joel know, his ordeal was far from over. The true nature of Black River National Forest, and the horrors it contained, were only beginning to reveal themselves. As he tossed and turned in his uneasy sleep, something ancient and terrible stirred in the depths of the forest, awakened by the presence of an unwitting intruder in its domain. Joel's fitful sleep was shattered by a sound that sent ice through his veins, a low, rumbling growl so deep it seemed to vibrate the very air around him. His eyes snapped open, heart pounding in his chest. For a moment, he lay perfectly still, hoping against hope that it had been a dream, a product of his overwrought imagination. But then it came again, louder this time, unmistakably real. It was a sound that didn't belong in this world, a noise that spoke of something massive and primordial. Joel's mind raced back to the creature he'd seen in the forest. If that had been the prey, what kind of predator could have taken it down? Slowly, careful not to make a sound, Joel rose from the bed. The RV was dark, the only light coming from the dim glow of the moon filtering through the curtains. He crept to the window, his heart pounding so loudly he was sure it would give him away. Peering out into the darkness, Joel's eyes strained to make sense of the shadows. At first, he saw nothing but the silvery surface of the lake and the dark mass of trees beyond. Then something moved. It was huge, far larger than any animal Joel had ever seen. In the pale moonlight, he could make out a massive, shaggy form prowling at the edge of the clearing. It moved with an unnatural grace for its size, each step deliberate and silent. As it turned, moonlight glinted off eyes that glowed with an eerie amber light. They were intelligent eyes, filled with a predatory hunger that made Joel's blood run cold. This was a creature of nightmares, something that shouldn't exist in the rational world Joel thought he knew. The beast let out another rumbling growl, and the RV shook slightly. It was testing the vehicle, Joel realized with growing horror. This thing was hunting him. For what felt like hours, Joel remained frozen at the window, watching as the creature circled the RV. It would disappear into the shadows of the forest, only to emerge again from a different direction. Each time it reappeared, it seemed to get a little closer, a little bolder. Joel's mind raced, trying to come up with a plan. He could try to start the RV and drive away, but would the engine noise provoke the creature into attacking? And even if he got the vehicle moving, could he navigate the dark, narrow forest roads with that thing in pursuit? As dawn began to break, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold, the creature retreated into the forest. Its departure brought little relief to Joel, who remained vigilant, expecting it to reappear at any moment. When the sun finally rose, bathing the clearing in warm light, Joel allowed himself to relax slightly. He quickly packed up his belongings, his hands shaking as he worked. He needed to get out of here, to get back to the safety and familiarity of the city. As he was preparing to leave, a knock on the RV door nearly caused Joel to jump out of his skin. Heart racing, he approached the door cautiously. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice hoarse with fear. "Park Ranger," came the reply. "Just doing a routine check. Everything okay in there?" Joel hesitated for a moment before opening the door. Standing before him was a tall, weathered man in a ranger's uniform. His name tag read Richardson. "You look like you've seen a ghost, son," Richardson said, his brow furrowing with concern. "Everything all right?" The words tumbled out of Joel before he could stop them. He told the ranger everything, about the creature he'd found in the forest, about the thing that had stalked the RV all night. As he spoke, he realized how crazy it all sounded. To his surprise, Richardson didn't laugh or dismiss his story. Instead, the ranger's face grew grave. "You say you saw it? And it came after you?" he asked, his voice low and urgent. Joel nodded, relief flooding through him at being believed. Richardson sighed heavily. "I was afraid this might happen. Come with me. There's something you need to know." Joel followed Richardson to a small cabin that served as the ranger station. Inside, maps and wildlife charts covered the walls, but Joel's attention was drawn to a locked cabinet in the corner. Richardson opened it, pulling out an old leather-bound book. "What I'm about to tell you isn't public knowledge," Richardson began, his voice solemn. "Black River has a history, one that goes back long before this was a national forest." He opened the book, revealing pages filled with handwritten accounts and crude sketches. Joel's breath caught in his throat as he recognized the creature from the night before, rendered in faded ink. "The indigenous people who lived here called it the Wendigo," Richardson explained, "a spirit of insatiable hunger and winter. The early settlers thought it was just a legend, but some of us know better." Over the next hour, Richardson shared the secret history of Black River, the disappearances that had been covered up, the sightings that had been dismissed. It was a tale of an ancient evil that slumbered in the depths of the forest, awakening periodically to hunt. "But why tell me this?" Joel asked, his mind reeling from the revelations. Richardson's eyes met Joel's, filled with a mix of sorrow and determination. "Because you've seen it. And now that it's seen you, it won't stop. The Wendigo has marked you, son. It'll follow you, hunt you, even if you leave this place." Joel felt the blood drain from his face. What am I supposed to do?" The old ranger stood, walking to a locked chest in the corner of the cabin. "We fight," he said simply, opening the chest to reveal an array of weapons. "Every few generations, someone has to stand against it to drive it back into hibernation. Looks like it's our turn." As Joel stared at the arsenal before him, a strange calm settled over him. The fear was still there, but it was overshadowed by a growing resolve. He thought of his life in the city, of the mundane problems that had seemed so important just days ago. Now, faced with an ancient evil, he realized he had found something he never knew he was looking for. A purpose. "Okay," Joel said, surprised by the steadiness in his voice. "What's the plan?" Richardson smiled grimly, handing Joel an old but well-maintained rifle. "We prepare. We hunt. And when the time comes, we face it. Together." As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Joel and Richardson began their preparations. The forest around them was quiet, but both men knew it was the calm before the storm. Somewhere in the shadowy depths of Black River, an ancient evil was waiting, and when night fell, the true battle would begin. As dusk approached, Joel found himself perched in a makeshift blind high up in an old oak tree. Richardson was in a similar position about 50 yards away, barely visible in the gathering gloom. The plan was to lure the Wendigo into a clearing rigged with traps, then hit it with everything they had. Joel's hands were sweaty on the rifle, his ears straining for any unusual sound. The forest had gone unnaturally quiet, as if every living thing was holding its breath in anticipation of what was to come. A twig snapped in the distance, and Joel's head whipped around. Was it just an animal, or something more sinister. The shadows between the trees seemed to move, playing tricks on his eyes. Then he saw it. A massive shape, moving with preternatural stealth through the underbrush. Joel's breath caught in his throat as the Wendigo emerged into the clearing. In the fading light, he could see it clearly for the first time. It was even more terrifying than he remembered. Easily 12 feet tall when standing upright, the creature was a nightmarish fusion of bear, wolf, and something altogether inhuman. Its fur was matted and caked with dirt and what looked horribly like dried blood. But it was the eyes that truly chilled Joel to his core, glowing with an inner fire, filled with an intelligence and malevolence that was unmistakably evil. Joel raised his rifle, trying to steady his aim. Richardson had been clear. They needed to wound it, drive it towards the traps. But as Joel's finger tightened on the trigger, the Wendigo's head snapped up, its glowing eyes locking directly onto his position. With a roar that shook the very trees, the creature charged. It moved with impossible speed, covering the distance to Joel's tree in seconds. Panicking, Joel fired, the shot going wide. The Wendigo slammed into the tree, nearly toppling it. Joel clung to his perch, heart pounding. Below him, the creature circled, its claws leaving deep gouges in the trunk. It was toying with him, he realized. This wasn't just a hunt for food. The Wendigo was enjoying his fear. Suddenly, another shot rang out. Richardson had opened fire, drawing the creature's attention. The Wendigo whirled, charging towards the ranger's position. Joel used the distraction to scramble down from the tree, his legs shaky but propelled by adrenaline. What followed was a chaotic dance of death through the darkening forest. Joel and Richardson worked in tandem, firing shots to herd the creature towards their traps. But the Wendigo was cunning, always seeming to be one step ahead. As they neared the rigged clearing, Joel's foot caught on a root. He went down hard, the rifle flying from his grasp. He rolled, expecting at any moment to feel the Wendigo's claws tearing into him. Instead, he heard Richardson's voice, raised in a desperate shout. "Over here, you bastard! Come on!" Joel looked up to see Richardson standing in the center of the clearing, arms raised. The Wendigo, sensing easy prey, charged straight for him. "No!" Joel cried out, but it was too late. The creature was almost upon Richardson when the ranger smiled and pressed a detonator in his hand. The clearing erupted in a chain of explosions. Fire and shrapnel tore through the air, engulfing both Richardson and the Wendigo. The creature's agonized howl rose above the din, a sound of pain and fury that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. When the smoke cleared, Joel staggered to his feet. The clearing was a scene of devastation, and at its center lay two bodies, one human, one monstrous. Tears streaming down his face, Joel approached. Richardson was gone, his sacrifice evident in the peaceful expression on his face. And the Wendigo. Joel's breath caught. The creature was wounded, grievously so, but it was still alive. As he watched, it began to stir, its regenerative powers already at work. In that moment, Joel understood what he had to do. Picking up Richardson's fallen rifle, he approached the Wendigo. The creature's eyes opened, meeting Joel's gaze. In them, he saw not just hunger and evil, but something more. A flicker of fear. "This ends now," Joel said, his voice steady, and he opened fire. Weeks later, Joel stood at the edge of Black River National Forest. Behind him, a team of government officials were cordoning off the area, their questions still unanswered. The official story would be a forest fire, a tragic accident that claimed the life of a brave park ranger. But Joel knew the truth. He could feel it in the way the forest had changed, as if a great shadow had been lifted. The Wendigo was gone, banished back to whatever dark realm it had come from. But for how long? As he turned to leave, Joel caught a glimpse of movement in the trees. For a heart-stopping moment, he thought he saw glowing eyes watching him. But it was just a deer, regarding him curiously before bounding away. Joel smiled, feeling the weight of Richardson's journal in his backpack. The old ranger had known this day might come, had prepared for it. And now, that responsibility passed to Joel. He walked back to his car, knowing that his life had been forever changed. The world was bigger, darker, and more wondrous than he had ever imagined. And somewhere out there, other ancient evils slumbered. But when they awoke, they would find humanity ready. And Joel would be there, standing guard at the edge of darkness, ready to face whatever came. As he drove away from Black River, Joel felt a mix of emotions: grief for Richardson, pride in what they had accomplished, and a newfound sense of purpose. The city and his old life awaited, but he knew he would return to the forest one day. I've always been drawn to the wilderness, even before that fateful summer in the Adirondacks. Growing up in suburban Albany, I spent countless weekends exploring the nearby forests with my father, learning to identify plants and track animals. He taught me everything from tying the perfect bowline knot to reading weather patterns in the clouds. Those early adventures sparked a passion that would shape my entire life and nearly end it. By the time I entered college at SUNY Environmental Science and Forestry, I had already logged hundreds of miles on various trails throughout the Northeast. My weekends were spent either leading student hiking groups or working at the local REI, where I could talk about gear and trails for hours. That's where I met Sarah and Mike, who would become my closest friends and regular hiking companions. We were the kind of people who planned our next trip while still on the trail, always chasing that next summit or hidden waterfall. Our trio became known around campus for organizing these elaborate backcountry expeditions. We'd disappear for days into the High Peaks wilderness, returning with stories of close encounters with black bears and nights spent in emergency shelters during unexpected storms. Those experiences taught us respect for the wilderness, but they also gave us a dangerous sense of invincibility. We thought we could handle anything the mountains threw at us. Looking back, I realize how naive we were. All those years of successful hikes, all that accumulated knowledge, none of it prepared us for what we would encounter in the summer of 2023. Sometimes I wonder if anything could have. Sarah was the first to hear about the Blackwood Trail from one of her geology professors. It wasn't on any official maps, just a local legend among serious hikers, supposedly offering access to some of the most pristine wilderness in the entire park. The professor mentioned something about unusual rock formations and old-growth forest that had somehow escaped logging. That should have been our first red flag. In the heavily mapped and documented Adirondacks, an unofficial trail usually means there's a good reason it's kept off the books. But we were at that perfect age, 26, just enough experience to be dangerous, just enough youth to feel immortal. We had all recently graduated and were working our first real jobs. Mike was at an environmental consulting firm, Sarah was finishing her master's thesis on glacial geology, and I had landed a position as a park naturalist. We saw the Blackwood Trail as our last hurrah before fully surrendering to adulthood. I remember the night we made the decision to attempt it. We were at Mike's apartment, sharing a bottle of whiskey and poring over topographical maps. Sarah had managed to get rough coordinates from her professor, and we spent hours plotting potential routes, calculating supplies, and discussing contingencies. The excitement in the room was palpable. We'd done dozens of difficult hikes before, but this felt different, like we were about to discover something truly special. "Think about it," Sarah had said, her eyes bright with enthusiasm. "An undocumented trail in one of the most popular hiking regions in the Northeast. There has to be something incredible up there." Mike was more practical, focusing on logistics, water sources, elevation gains, potential campsites. I remember him insisting we pack extra emergency supplies, something he'd never done before. At the time, I teased him about being overcautious. Now I thank God for that instinct. None of us slept much that night. We were too busy planning, too excited about the adventure ahead. If I had known then what awaited us on that trail, the horror that would change our lives forever, I would have burned those maps and never looked back. But that's the thing about life-changing moments. You never recognize them until it's too late. The next 2 weeks were a flurry of preparation. We approached it with the same methodical attention to detail that had served us well on previous expeditions, but with an extra layer of caution. This wasn't a marked trail with regular traffic and established campsites. We needed to be entirely self-sufficient. I took charge of the gear list, spending hours in my basement checking and double-checking every piece of equipment. Our usual ultralight approach wouldn't cut it here. We needed redundancy for critical items. 2 water filtration systems, backup battery banks for our GPS devices, extra first aid supplies. The weight of our packs would be brutal, but as Mike kept reminding us, better tired than sorry. Sarah threw herself into research, trying to find any historical information about the area. She spent days in the university library, digging through old survey maps and local history books. What she found was strange, or rather, what she didn't find. The area around Blackwood Trail was like a blank spot in the records. No logging history, no survey data, not even any mention in old hiking guides. It was as if that particular section of forest had been deliberately overlooked. "Guys, look at this," she said one evening, spreading out a series of maps on my kitchen table. "Here's a geological survey from 1923 and here's one from 1956. See how they both just skip over this section? The contour lines just stop and start again, like they couldn't or wouldn't map it." Mike was more concerned with the practical aspects. He calculated our daily calorie needs and planned meals with military precision. He even insisted we each carry a personal locator beacon, something we'd always considered overkill before. "If something goes wrong out there," he said, "we can't count on running into other hikers to help." The weekend before our departure, we did a final gear check at my place. The living room looked like an REI had exploded. 3 65-liter packs, sleeping bags rated for unexpected cold snaps, a 4-season tent, emergency bivy sacks, first aid kits, bear canisters, rope, climbing hardware, and enough freeze-dried meals to last a week. As we sorted through the equipment, Sarah shared some of the local legends she'd uncovered in her research. "There are these old stories," she said hesitantly, "about hikers going missing in that area. Nothing confirmed, just rumors really, but..." She trailed off, and for a moment, the only sound was the crinkling of dry bags being packed. "Every wilderness area has those stories," I said, more confidently than I felt. "People get lost because they're unprepared. We know what we're doing." But that night, as I laid in bed making mental checklists, I couldn't shake a growing sense of unease. It wasn't just normal pre-trip jitters, it was something deeper, more primal. Like some ancient part of my brain was trying to warn me. I remember checking my phone one last time before falling asleep. There was a text from Sarah. "Found something weird in an old newspaper. Can we talk tomorrow before we leave?" I never got to hear what she found. The next morning, caught up in the excitement and rush of final preparations, I forgot to ask. It's funny how the mind works, how the most crucial details can slip away just when you need them most. That forgotten conversation would come back to haunt me in the days ahead, during those long, terrible nights when we realized exactly what we'd walked into. The morning we set out was deceptively perfect, one of those crisp September days when the air feels like crystal, and the early autumn colors paint the mountains in fire. We parked Mike's Subaru at an unmarked pullout Sarah had identified, our topo maps suggesting this was the closest access point to our target area. The first few hours were exactly what we expected, challenging but manageable terrain through old-growth forest. The trees here were ancient, their trunks wider than any I'd seen in the Adirondacks before. The canopy was so dense that by early afternoon, the forest floor was bathed in a perpetual twilight. "Notice anything weird?" Sarah asked around lunch, as we rested on fallen logs eating trail mix. "Listen." We did. And that's when it hit me, the silence. No birdsong, no rustling in the underbrush, not even the usual whisper of wind through leaves. Just the sound of our own breathing and the crunch of granola. "Animals avoid some areas," Mike offered, but his voice had an edge I'd never heard before. Could be something natural we can't smell or sense. As we pushed deeper into the wilderness, the trail became increasingly difficult to follow. What had started as a faint game path deteriorated into almost nothing, forcing us to navigate primarily by GPS and compass. The vegetation changed too, subtly at first, then dramatically. The familiar maple and birch gave way to twisted, ancient pines with bark so dark it looked almost black. By evening, when we made camp, none of us mentioned how the temperature had dropped far below what the forecast predicted, or how our GPS devices were showing increasingly erratic readings. The first truly inexplicable thing happened that night. I was on final watch around 4 a.m. when I noticed something odd about the trees surrounding our campsite. In the dim light of my headlamp, I could have sworn the patterns in the bark were different from what they'd been hours earlier, more intricate, almost like writing. I blinked hard, convinced my tired mind was playing tricks. But when I looked again, I saw something that turned my blood to ice. A handprint, pressed into the bark as if the tree itself had been soft as clay when it was made. And it was fresh, the sap still glistening. I didn't wake the others. I wish I had. The next morning, we found all our water had frozen solid, despite temperatures that shouldn't have dropped below 40-degree nines. As we chipped at the ice in our bottles, Mike pointed out something that made my stomach lurch, a set of tracks in the frost-covered ground, circling our tent. They looked almost human, except for the impossible length of the fingers and the way each print was reversed, as if whatever made them had been walking backward. We should have turned back then. Any sane person would have. But we'd come so far, and Sarah was convinced we were close to something significant. The geological anomalies she'd been tracking were growing more pronounced. Rock formations that seemed to defy gravity, and strange, perfectly circular clearings that appeared and disappeared in the distance. The forest grew denser, darker. The trees seemed to press in around us, their branches reaching like grasping hands. Our compasses began spinning wildly, and all 3 GPS units died simultaneously, despite having fresh batteries. We were navigating blind, but Sarah insisted she could feel where we needed to go. That afternoon, we found the stones. Dozens of them, each about chest high, arranged in a pattern that couldn't have been natural. They were covered in carvings. Not the crude graffiti of hikers, but deeply carved symbols that seemed to shift and change when viewed from different angles. At the center of the arrangement was a pile of branches, arranged in a neat pyramid. On top sat our missing water bottles, completely empty. The ones that had frozen solid that morning. The ones we'd left at our last campsite, over 5 miles back. It happened just before sunset. The light was fading faster than it should have, and the temperature was plummeting again. We were setting up camp when we heard it. A sound like wet wood splintering, followed by what could have been singing if you took a human voice and played it backward. Sarah saw it first. She didn't scream. She just stopped, mid-sentence, her face draining of all color. When I followed her gaze, I understood why. It was standing between 2 of the ancient pines, its height difficult to determine because it seemed to bend and fold in impossible ways. Its skin was like bark, but it moved like water. The face, if you could call it that, was a hollow, a darkness deeper than the gathering night. But worst of all were its hands, long, twisted things with too many joints, each finger ending in what looked like another finger, and another after that, fractal-like, infinite. When it moved, it didn't walk so much as flow. leaving the ground blackened and smoking in its wake. The air grew thick with a smell like wet ashes and burning plastic. Mike reacted first, shoving us toward what he thought was the way back. We ran. God, how we ran. Through darkness that seemed alive, past trees that reached for us with sharp branches, over ground that sometimes felt solid and sometimes felt like it was trying to pull us under. The thing followed, not quickly, but with a terrible inevitability. Sometimes we'd hear it behind us, sometimes ahead. Its calling grew louder, a sound that made my nose bleed and my vision blur. Sarah fell once, and when we pulled her up, she was laughing uncontrollably, blood trickling from her ears. We ran through the night, through what felt like years of darkness. When dawn finally came, we were miles from where we thought we were, somehow having emerged on the opposite side of the mountain range. Sarah was burning with fever, still mumbling about the symbols on the stones. Mike's hair had gone completely white. The rescue team found us 3 days later, severely dehydrated and babbling about impossible things. They said we were lucky. There had been other hikers in that area who were never found. The official report blamed our experience on hypothermia and group hallucination. The physical effects healed, mostly. Sarah's fever broke after a week in the hospital, though she never fully recovered her short-term memory. Mike's hair stayed white, and he developed a stutter that gets worse whenever he tries to talk about what happened. The nightmares are the worst part. Not because they're frightening, though they are, but because they're consistent. All 3 of us have them, exactly the same ones, on exactly the same nights. We dream of those symbols, of what they mean, of what they're calling to. Sometimes on the darkest nights, I'll wake to find my walls covered in frost, even in summer. And in that frost, if I look carefully, I can see those same symbols we found on the stones, written in a hand that's not quite human. We've heard stories since then, from others who've ventured into those woods. Most just report feeling watched, or experiencing lost time. But some tell of finding strange arrangements of stones, or of hearing singing that makes their teeth ache. Last month, Sarah called me at 3 a.m., hysterical. She'd been going through her old research notes and found something she'd missed before. Those symbols we saw, they appear in cave paintings across the world, some dating back 30,000 years, always in places where people vanished. I don't hike anymore. Can't even walk in Central Park without breaking into a cold sweat. Mike moved to Arizona, saying he needed somewhere without trees. Sarah threw herself into her research, trying to understand what we encountered. She says she's close to something, but I'm not sure I want to know what. Sometimes I wonder if we actually escaped, or if whatever we met in those woods simply let us go. Why us, when so many others vanished? The answer comes to me sometimes, in those shared nightmares. We weren't meant to escape. We were meant to spread the story, to draw others to those woods. Like seeds scattered in the wind, or spores finding new hosts. If you're reading this, consider it a warning. The Adirondacks are vast, and some parts of them were never meant to be found. If you're hiking and the birds go quiet, if you find stones arranged in circles, if the trees seem to be watching, turn back. Turn back while you still can. Because sometimes, the greatest horror isn't in what happens to you, but in realizing you've become part of something's plan. And lately, I've noticed my skin feels different. Rougher. Almost like bark.